My name is Marlowe Kessler. I'm 34 years old. And the day I found out my own parents had told a judge I was a missing person, I was sitting 40 feet behind them in a courtroom gallery, very much alive, wearing my work badge, holding a folder that proved every word they'd sworn to was a lie. They didn't see me yet. My mother was dabbing her eyes with a tissue she'd clearly practiced with. My father sat beside her in his good church jacket, staring at his hands. And up at the front, a probate judge was reading through a petition that used my full legal name 11 times and the word missing 9. I want to tell you what it feels like to watch two people ask a court's permission to take something that's yours, using your own disappearance as the excuse, when you never once disappeared. But first I have to take you back 4 years, to a phone call I stopped answering, and 11 years before that, to the year I became the only Kessler anyone could count on. Welcome back to Frost Narratives. If you've ever been the one who held a family together and got erased for it anyway, this one's for you. Drop a comment if you've lived any version of this, and stick with me, because what was actually inside my folder that day is the reason my mother's face changed color in open court. I grew up in Larkspur, Oregon, a town small enough that everybody's business is everybody's business whether they want it or not. My father, Warren Kessler, ran a hardware store his own father had started, and for most of my childhood it did fine. Not rich, but fine. My mother, Paulette, kept the books for it and kept the house and kept score of every sacrifice she ever made, out loud, at every opportunity. I have one brother, Colton, 2 years older than me, and if you want to understand my entire family in one sentence, here it is. Colton got a new bike the year our old dog died, because my mother said grief needed a bright side, and I got told to stop crying because I was making it about myself. That was the pattern of my whole childhood, if I'm honest. Colton was the golden one. Charming, funny, always the center of a room. I was the reliable one, the one who got good grades without being asked, who noticed when the lights bill looked thin and started babysitting at 12 to help quietly. Nobody ever told me to do that. I just watched my mother's face when the mail came, and I started fixing things before anyone had to ask. The store started failing when I was 19 and away at nursing school on a scholarship I'd fought hard for. A big home improvement chain opened 40 minutes away, and within 2 years my father's store was bleeding money every month. Then it turned out he'd been quietly borrowing against the house to keep it open, and then it turned out some of that borrowed money had gone somewhere that wasn't the store at all. My mother never said the word gambling out loud to me. She called it your father's bad stretch. I was 21 before I understood what that actually meant. I finished my degree, took the first job I could get, and started sending money home before I'd even unpacked my first apartment. It felt like the only decent thing to do. I was 23. I told myself it was temporary, just until the store stabilized, just until Dad got back on his feet. Here's the part that matters, so hold on to it. I became a flight paramedic 3 years later, the kind of nurse who rides a helicopter out to car wrecks and farm accidents and disasters too far from a hospital to reach any other way. It is exactly as intense as it sounds, and it comes with something most jobs don't: real stretches of being completely off the grid. No signal over a mountain pass. Weeks at a time on federal disaster deployments with no cell service at all. Anyone who knew what I did for a living knew that going quiet for a while wasn't unusual for me. I didn't know yet that this would end up being the single most useful detail of my entire life to the two people who raised me. By the time I was 30, I had a life of my own too, even if I never talked about it much on those Sunday calls, because the calls never left room for it. I have a partner, Theo, quiet and steady in a way my own house never was, and a daughter, Bea, who was 3 the spring this all started to unravel. Theo used to ask me, gently, after every call home, why I always sounded smaller on the phone than I did 5 minutes before I picked it up. I never had a good answer for him. I just knew it was true. For 11 years, I sent money home. It started at $200 a month and climbed, as my pay climbed, to almost $1,000. Birthdays, Christmas, whatever came up. A new roof after a bad storm. Property taxes 1 year when things got tight. I never once made a show of it. I set up an automatic transfer and let it run quietly in the background of my life, the way you'd pay off a debt you didn't remember taking on but felt certain you owed. My mother had one phrase she used every single time the subject came up, and I want you to really hear it, because it's going to matter later. "You're so good to us, Marlowe. I don't know what we'd do without you." Never thank you. Never let me help too. Just we'd be lost without you, said with a hand on my arm and a look that made refusing feel like cruelty. Meanwhile, Colton drifted from one plan to the next. A landscaping business that lasted 8 months. A food truck that lasted 5. A sure-thing investment in a friend's vape shop that folded within a year. Every single time, my parents called it a rough patch. Every single time, somehow, the rough patch got smoothed out, and I never once asked with what. I want to be honest with you about why I didn't ask. Because the one time I tried, early on, gently, just wondering out loud whether the store was actually breaking even yet, my mother's whole face changed like weather. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, and her voice had gone thin and hurt. "Your father works himself into the ground, and you're sitting there asking for receipts like we're strangers." "I wasn't asking for receipts, Mom. I just wanted to understand where things stood." "You want to understand?" She let out a small, wounded laugh. "You want to audit us, you mean? After everything we sacrificed raising you, this is the thanks. My own daughter keeping score." She put a hand to her chest and said she felt her heart racing. Within the hour, my father called to tell me I'd upset her so badly she'd had to lie down, and did I really need to make everything about money? So I learned the price of asking, and the price was too high. I stopped asking. I told myself that was maturity, choosing peace over pride. I didn't understand yet that peace you buy every month isn't peace. It's a receipt, and receipts, it turns out, can be called in. If you've ever paid for peace in your own family and started wondering what the total actually was, comment "receipt" below, because I finally did the math, and it broke something open I couldn't close back up. I flew home for a rare 48-hour break in the spring I turned 30. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. My schedule made planning ahead almost pointless, so I'd gotten in the habit of just showing up when I could and calling it a nice surprise. I pulled into my parents' driveway, and there was a truck there I didn't recognize. Brand new, still had the paper plates in the back window. I figured it was a neighbor's, until I walked in the back door and found Colton at the kitchen table with a set of golf clubs leaning against the wall behind him, still in the plastic. I asked whose truck it was. My mother's answer came a half-second too fast to be anything but rehearsed. Colton needed reliable transportation for the new opportunity. Colton didn't even look up from his phone. "It's a lease, Mar, calm down. It's basically free." Nothing is basically free. I know that better than almost anyone, because I have spent 11 years being the free thing in this family, the reliable transportation nobody ever had to lease. But I didn't say that. I smiled, and I asked about the golf clubs still in their plastic, and my father said something about a networking thing Colton was trying, and the new opportunity turned out, 6 months later, to be another friend's business, another sure thing, another folded venture nobody ever mentioned again. I didn't say anything that day. I want to be honest about that too. I told myself it wasn't my business how they spent their own money, and maybe it wouldn't have been, except 3 weeks later my mother called asking if I could send a little extra that month because my father's blood pressure medication had gone up in price and they were stretched thin. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Stretched thin. While a truck with paper plates sat in the driveway and unopened golf clubs leaned against my mother's kitchen wall. I started paying closer attention after that, the quiet way you learn to when you've finally noticed something is off, but you're not ready to blow it all up yet. I noticed the medication story came up almost every time Colton needed something. I noticed the property tax emergency lined up suspiciously well with the timing of Colton's food truck lease. I noticed that not once, in 11 years, had anyone in that house ever once asked how I was doing without immediately pivoting to what I could send. I didn't blow it up right away. I want you to understand that, because what I did instead is the part that actually matters. I started keeping my own quiet records. Every transfer, every date, every excuse that came with it, laid out in a spreadsheet the way I chart a patient's vitals, because numbers don't lie even when people do. It took me 2 more years to work up the nerve to ask the only question I'd ever really wanted to ask. And when I finally did, on a Sunday call, calm and careful, just wondering if maybe we could sit down together sometime and look at where the household money was actually going, my mother didn't yell. She did something worse. She went completely quiet, and then she said, in a voice I'd never heard her use on me before, "I never thought my own daughter would treat me like a stranger she's auditing." That word, auditing. Like 11 years of quietly wiring money into a house I hadn't lived in since I was 18 was some kind of hostile investigation instead of what it actually was, which was love with no floor under it. I didn't have an answer for that. I hung up, and I sat in my apartment in Denver, and for the first time in over a decade, I didn't send the transfer that month. I want to tell you what happened over the next 4 years, because it is not what you'd expect, and it is absolutely not what my mother told an entire town it was. But that part needs its own space. For now, I'll just tell you this. I never disappeared. Not once. I changed a phone number for my own peace, and I stopped a monthly transfer that had quietly bankrolled someone else's whole adult life, and I kept flying my job and living my life in plain sight the entire time. 4 years later, I was standing in the parking lot of a grocery store in Larkspur during a visit to see an old friend, and a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years walked straight past me, stopped dead in her tracks, turned around, and said my name like she was looking at a ghost. "Marlowe, oh my God, Marlowe, is that actually you?" I said of course it was me, and she put both hands over her mouth, and what she said next is the exact moment this whole story really starts. "We thought you were missing." My cousin Colleen stood in that grocery store parking lot with both hands still over her mouth, and I remember thinking how strange it was to watch someone look at you like you'd walked out of a headline. "They told everyone you vanished," she said. "After you two had some kind of falling out, your mom cries about it at church. There's a whole Facebook group, Marlowe. Bring Marlowe home. People from the old neighborhood share it. Somebody even set up a donation jar at the diner for a private investigator." I stood there in that parking lot holding a bag of groceries for a friend's dinner party, in a town I'd grown up in, wearing a jacket with my own hospital's logo stitched on the chest, and I could not make the sentence fit together in my head. A donation jar. For a woman who had never once been lost. Let me tell you what actually happened, because it's nothing like what that jar was collecting money for. I stopped the monthly transfer the same week my mother called me a stranger auditing her own family. I didn't disappear. I kept my same number for almost a year after that, the same job, the same apartment. What changed was that I finally, quietly, stopped funding a household I hadn't lived in for over a decade. The calls didn't stop right away. If anything, they got louder. My mother called twice a week instead of once, and every call circled back to money within the first 5 minutes, usually dressed up as something else. Dad's blood pressure. The roof again. A property tax bill she'd apparently forgotten to mention was already 2 months late. When I said, gently, that I needed some time to reevaluate what I could send, she told me I was choosing to let my own father go without his medication. I want to be very clear about something, because it matters for what comes later. I never once said I wouldn't help in a real emergency. I said I needed honesty about where the help was actually going. That was the whole ask. 11 years of automatic transfers, and all I wanted in return was the truth. One call in particular stayed with me. My mother phoned on a Tuesday night, her voice already thick before I'd said hello. "Your father hasn't slept in days worrying about the tax bill. Do you know what that does to a man his age? Do you know what it does to me, watching him fall apart, knowing my own daughter could fix it in an afternoon and won't?" "I'll help with a real bill, Mom. Send me the actual notice. I just want to see it." The silence that followed told me everything. There was no notice coming. There never was, not one single time in 11 years, an actual document I was ever shown. They couldn't give me that. So instead, 6 weeks after I stopped the transfer, they gave me something else. Theo and I were living in a rental outside Denver at the time, barely 4, and I'd just come off a brutal double rotation, the kind that leaves you hollowed out in a way sleep doesn't fully fix. I came home to find my parents' car in our driveway. They had driven 14 hours without calling first, walked past Theo at the front door before he could really process what was happening, and were sitting in my living room when I walked in. My mother stood up like she'd rehearsed it the whole drive. "We're not leaving until you tell us why you're doing this to this family." I asked them to leave. I said it calmly, the way I've learned to say things when a situation is escalating and somebody in the room needs to stay steady. My father wouldn't look at me. My mother kept going, louder now, about ingratitude, about everything they'd sacrificed, about how selfish it was to sit in a nice house with a healthy child while her own son struggled. And then she said the thing that ended it. She looked at B, who had wandered in confused by the raised voices, and she said, "I hope you remember this when you're older, sweetheart. I hope you remember your mother chose money over her own family." I have stood in helicopters over car wrecks and told strangers their husband didn't make it. I have never in my life gone as cold as I went in that living room, watching my mother say that sentence to my 3-year-old daughter to win an argument with me. I asked them to leave a second time. When they didn't, Theo asked them a third time, and that time they went. That night I blocked both their numbers, not because I wanted them gone from my life forever, because I needed 1 week where my daughter wasn't collateral in a fight that had never once been about medication or roofs. 1 week became 4 years, because every single time I tried to reopen a door, even a crack, the same pattern came right back through it. If you've ever had to protect your kid from your own parents, comment collateral below, because that night is the reason everything after it happened the way it did. Here's what I actually did during those 4 years, because I want the record straight before we get to the part where somebody lied about it to an entire town. I kept my job. Same employer, same license number, publicly searchable through the state nursing board the entire time. I filed my taxes every single year with my current address. I kept a LinkedIn profile with my job title front and center, because flight programs recruit off it constantly. I sent 2 certified letters home during those 4 years, both through the postal service, both requiring a signature. The first was 6 months in, a short letter explaining I needed space and would reach out when I was ready. Returned, unclaimed, 30 days later. The second was almost 3 years in, after I heard through a distant cousin that my grandmother, Vera, wasn't doing well, letting my parents know I'd want to be told if anything changed with her health. Also returned, also unclaimed. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's going to matter enormously very soon. My own parents refused certified mail from a daughter they were telling the whole town they couldn't find. My grandmother Vera was my mother's mother, and she was the one relative in that whole family who ever looked at the dynamic clearly and said something about it out loud. When I was 16, home from babysitting money I'd handed straight to my mother for groceries. Vera pulled me aside in her kitchen and said, "You're going to spend your whole life being useful to people who never once ask if you're all right. Somebody in this family needs to notice you before you disappear trying to be needed." I didn't understand what she meant until I was in my 30s. Vera died 18 months into my estrangement. I didn't hear about it from my parents. I heard about it from an obituary a childhood friend sent me, 3 weeks after the funeral had already happened, with a message that just said, "I'm so sorry, I assumed you knew." I didn't go to the funeral because I never knew there was one. I grieved her alone in a hospital break room between calls, the same place I'd grieved most things in my adult life. What I didn't know then, standing in that parking lot with Colleen 4 years later, was that my grandmother had left a will. And in that will, she'd left me the lake cabin she'd owned outright since before I was born, along with a modest investment account she'd built slowly over 40 years working as a school secretary. Not to my mother. Not to Colton. To me, by name, with a note the attorney later told me had been attached to the file. Marlowe gave more to this family than anyone ever gave her. This is not charity. This is overdue. My mother, according to Colleen, had told the whole church that the will, obviously, needed to be handled carefully, since poor Marlowe couldn't be located to receive her share, And wasn't it a blessing that Vera had trusted the family to look after things until she came home? I got Colleen to send me the Facebook group that same night, sitting in my rental car outside the grocery store while Theo watched me back at the friend's house. Bring Marlowe home. 412 members. Posts going back 3.5 years. Prayer requests. A photo of me from a decade earlier, captioned, "If you've seen our girl, please reach out." A pinned post from my mother, dated 11 months ago, thanking the community for their generosity toward the search fund, with a screenshot of a jar at the Larkspur Diner that had apparently raised over $2,000. $2,000 collected from a town who loved my parents, for a search that never happened, for a daughter who had never once been lost. I scrolled further before I could make myself stop. A woman I'd babysat for as a teenager had written, "Praying for your family, Paulette. Marlowe was always such a sweet girl. I just don't understand how someone walks away like that." A man who used to buy nails from my father's store had commented under a photo of me at 19, "If anyone's seen her, even just to know she's safe, please say something." My old 4th grade teacher had donated to the jar and left a heart emoji. Every single one of them believed they were being kind to 2 grieving parents. Every single one of them had no idea they were grieving a daughter who was, at that exact moment, 40 minutes from a hospital in Denver, filing a tax return with her real address on it. I sat in that car for a long time. I want to tell you I felt rage first, because that would make a cleaner story. What I actually felt was something closer to vertigo, the floor of my whole life tilting sideways. Because underneath the anger was a much colder, much more practical thought, the kind of thought that comes from a career spent thinking clearly when everything around you is falling apart. If they'd told the town I was missing to raise sympathy money, what exactly were they telling a probate court to get control of my grandmother's estate? It took 2 phone calls and 1 records request the next morning to find out. My grandmother's will had gone into probate 14 months earlier. And sitting in the public court file, plain as day, was a petition filed by my mother, Paulette Kessler, asking the court to appoint her as temporary administrator of the estate, on the grounds that the named primary beneficiary, myself, could not be located after diligent and repeated efforts, and was believed to have been out of contact with her family for a period exceeding 4 years under circumstances the family found deeply concerning. Diligent and repeated efforts. I had 2 returned certified letters in a drawer in Denver that said otherwise. I called an attorney the same afternoon, a woman named Renata Alvarez who specializes in probate disputes, and I laid the whole thing out for her the way I'd lay out a patient's chart. Every date, every transfer, every returned letter, the Facebook group, the donation jar, the truck with paper plates that started this whole unraveling 5 years earlier. Renata was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said the sentence that turned my stomach cold and steady at the same time. "Marlowe, if what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just a family falling out anymore. This is fraud on a probate court, and possibly on your community too, and you have documentation most people in your position would never think to keep." I told her I keep documentation for a living. It's how you know what's actually true when everyone in the room is telling you something different. There was a hearing date already on the calendar, 6 weeks out, where the court would rule on my mother's petition to be named administrator, in the continued absence of the beneficiary. Renata pulled her own copies of everything that week, the returned certified mail receipts with their little green cards, my employment verification letter, 3 years of tax transcripts with my Denver address printed plain across the top, even a screenshot of my state nursing license, active and searchable, the whole time I was supposedly unfindable. She built the file the way I build a chart, in order, dated, nothing left to argument. "They're not going to be able to explain the returned mail," she told me, tapping the 2 green signature cards. "A person can claim they tried and failed to reach someone. It's much harder to explain refusing an envelope with your daughter's name on the return address." Then she asked me one question before we hung up. "Do you want to file something in advance and let this get resolved on paper, or do you want to be in that room?" The courtroom smelled like every courtroom does, cold coffee, and old carpet, and it was smaller than I expected, which somehow made everything happening in it feel bigger. Fluorescent light flattened every face in the gallery to the same tired gray, and a handful of other families sat scattered through the benches waiting on their own case numbers, checking phones, bouncing knees. Renata sat beside me in the third row, a slim leather folder squared on her lap, and up front my mother sat at the petitioner's table beside a lawyer I didn't recognize, a thin, older man with a briefcase that looked older than he was. She wore a navy dress I remembered from my own high school graduation, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd clearly practiced with. My father sat next to her in his good church jacket, staring at his hands like they belonged to somebody else. Colton sat directly behind them, arms crossed, jaw tight, the way he used to look right before getting caught in a lie as a kid. None of them had turned around yet. None of them knew I was there. The judge, a woman named Odalise Reyna with reading glasses pushed low on her nose, worked through the calendar with the flat efficiency of someone who has seen every version of family grief a courtroom can produce. When she got to our case, she read the file number, then the petition out loud for the record. In the matter of the estate of Vera Whitfield, she said. Petition by Paulette Kessler for appointment as temporary administrator, on the grounds that the named primary beneficiary, Marlowe Kessler, cannot be located despite diligent and repeated efforts, and has been out of contact with her family for a period exceeding 4 years. My name said out loud in a courtroom, in a sentence built entirely out of a lie. I felt Renata's hand rest briefly on my arm, steady, telling me without a word to wait. Mrs. Kessler, the judge said, you may proceed with your testimony regarding the efforts made to locate the beneficiary. My mother rose, walked to the witness stand, and put her hand on the rail like she needed it to hold her up. She looked, I'll give her this, exactly like a grieving mother. She'd had 4 years of practice. Your Honor, we have exhausted every avenue, she said, voice trembling right on cue. Phone calls that went straight to voicemail, letters that came back unanswered. We hired someone at real cost to our family to try to trace her. My daughter simply vanished one day, and it has been the most painful chapter of my entire life, not knowing if she was safe, if she was even. She stopped, pressed the tissue to her mouth, let the silence finish the sentence the way she always had. The judge, not unmoved but clearly a woman who had learned not to be moved too quickly, asked a simple question. Can you describe the letters that came back unanswered? Do you have copies? My mother hesitated for exactly long enough that I felt Renata go very still beside me. I believe my husband kept those. It's been such a difficult time to stay organized. And the investigator you hired, the judge continued. Do you have a name, an invoice, anything documenting that search? Another hesitation. My father shifted in his seat but didn't speak. It was more of an informal arrangement, my mother said. A family friend who does that kind of work. We paid him in cash. I watched the judge's pen stop moving. Mrs. Kessler, Judge Reyna said, taking her glasses off entirely now. This court cannot appoint a temporary administrator on the basis of an informal, undocumented search paid in cash. I'll need something more concrete before I can rule on diligence. Has your family filed a missing persons report with any law enforcement agency? The question sat in the room a beat too long. We considered it, my mother said. We didn't want to make things worse if she was simply choosing this. So no report was filed. No, Your Honor. The lawyer beside her leaned in and murmured something. My mother straightened, recovered a little of her composure, and added, but I can assure the court, we searched every avenue available to a grieving family. We simply didn't know where else to turn. That was the moment Renata stood. Your Honor, if I may, my name is Renata Alvarez, and I represent Marlowe Kessler, the beneficiary named in this petition. She let that land for exactly 1 second. Ms. Kessler is present in the courtroom today. She has never been missing. I have never, in my entire career, watched a human body change direction as fast as my mother's did in that witness chair. She turned, and her eyes found mine in the third row, and every practiced tremor in her face fell away and left something underneath it I hadn't seen in years. Not grief. Fear. "Marlowe," she said, and it came out as barely a breath. Behind her, Colton's arms uncrossed. He half turned in his seat, saw me, and turned back around so fast it looked like it hurt. My father was the only one who didn't move at all. He just kept staring at his hands like he'd known, somehow, that this day was always going to arrive eventually, and had simply been waiting for it the whole time. The judge's voice cut cleanly through the moment. "Counsel, is your client prepared to testify?" I was already standing. 4 years of everything I'd carried came down to walking up that center aisle past my parents' table, past Colton, who wouldn't meet my eyes, and taking the seat my mother had just vacated. I was sworn in. I stated my full legal name for the record, the same one that had appeared 11 times in a petition claiming I couldn't be found. "Ms. Kessler," the judge said, "have you been in contact with your family over the past 4 years?" "No, Your Honor. I made the decision to limit contact after an incident involving my young daughter. I want to be clear that limiting contact and disappearing are not the same thing." "Explain the difference, please." "I kept my job the entire time. I'm a flight paramedic, licensed and searchable through the state nursing board. I filed my taxes every year with my current address. I have LinkedIn, a professional license, a mortgage under my legal name." I opened the folder Renata handed me. "And I sent 2 certified letters home during those 4 years, both requiring a signature. Both were refused and returned to me unclaimed." I held up the green signature cards, the little postal service receipts nobody thinks matter until they're the only proof you have. This one was sent 6 months into what my parents are calling a disappearance. This one was sent 3 years in, after I heard my grandmother was unwell. I set them on the rail in front of the judge. You can't refuse mail from someone you can't find. The courtroom had gone very quiet. My mother had both hands pressed flat against the table like she was trying to hold it, or herself, still. "There's more, Your Honor," I said, and I felt something steady settle into my voice, the same steadiness I use when a scene is chaos and somebody needs to hear facts, not fear. For most of that time, my parents were also telling my hometown a different story. There's a public Facebook group called Bring Marlowe Home, with over 400 members, describing me as a missing person believed to be in danger. There was a donation jar at a local diner collecting money for a private investigator search. The same search my mother just told this court cost real money to a family friend, paid in cash. I looked at my mother directly for the first time since I'd sat down. I'd like to know where that money actually went, because it clearly wasn't spent finding me. I was findable this entire time. Anyone who genuinely wanted to could have reached me in about 10 minutes. The lawyer beside my mother rose halfway out of his chair. "Your Honor, none of this is relevant to the administration of the estate. It's directly relevant to the diligence standard your client is asking this court to accept," Judge Reyna said, without even looking at him. She turned back to me. "Ms. Kessler, do you have documentation of your employment and residence for the period in question?" "Yes, Your Honor." Renata handed the second stack forward. "Continuous employment verification from Mercy Air Rescue, tax transcripts for all 4 years showing my current address, and my active state nursing license, which is searchable by anyone at any time, free of charge." The judge looked through the pages slowly, and for the first time since we'd walked in, the room felt like it was waiting on her instead of on my mother. "Mrs. Kessler," the judge said, setting the pages down, "do you have a response?" My mother stood without being asked to, which I later learned is not something you're supposed to do in a courtroom, and her voice came out cracked and much less rehearsed than anything she'd said so far. "You have no idea what it's like to lose a child even when they're not dead," she said, and it wasn't to the judge anymore, it was straight at me. "You blocked us. You took our granddaughter and you vanished from our lives, and you expect me to just sit quietly while you get everything your grandmother had, when your brother has nothing, when he's struggling, when—" "Mrs. Kessler," the judge said, sharper now, "this is a probate matter, not a forum for—" "He needed that money," my mother said, and it came out fast now, unstoppable, the way a dam doesn't crack slowly, it just goes. The house was going to be foreclosed on, do you understand that? The search fund, the donations, some of that went to Colton's truck payments because your father's blood pressure was through the roof from the stress of losing the store, and I could not watch this family fall apart one more time. I could not, so yes, I let people believe what they wanted to believe, because it kept a roof over your father's head. And you were fine. You were always fine. You were the one who was always fine. She stopped herself half a second too late, the way people do when they hear their own sentence land in a room and understand. All at once, exactly what they've just said out loud, on the record, in front of a judge, with a court reporter typing every word of it. Renata didn't move. She didn't have to. The judge had already stopped writing and was simply looking at my mother, and Colton, behind her, had gone the color of the courtroom walls. "Mom," his voice cracked on the single word. He was on his feet now, too, and for a second I thought he might actually defend her, might finally step in front of something instead of behind it. Instead, he said, quiet enough that I almost missed it, "You told me that money was from the house sale." My mother turned to look at her son, and whatever was left of her composure went with it. "Colton, not now." "You told me it was from the house," he said again, louder, and I realized, watching his face, that I was looking at a man discovering in real time that he might not have been the golden child so much as the last person in the family anyone bothered lying to carefully. "You said Grandma's house sold, and that was our share early." The judge set down her pen entirely. "Mr. Kessler, I'll ask you to sit down. This is not the forum for a family conversation." She looked between the three of them, then back at the file in front of her, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost every trace of the patience it started the morning with. "I've heard enough for today." The judge folded her hands and looked out over the courtroom, at my mother still standing, at Colton half out of his seat, at my father, who hadn't moved this entire time. "I'm denying the petition for temporary administration. The evidence presented does not support a finding that the beneficiary could not be located with reasonable diligence. In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite, that reasonable diligence was never attempted, and that representations made both to this court, and from what I've heard today to the public, may not have been accurate." She looked directly at my mother now. "I'm also going to refer this matter to the district attorney's office for review, specifically regarding the solicitation of donations under representations that a missing persons search was underway. That's outside my jurisdiction to rule on today, but it is not outside anyone's jurisdiction to look into." My mother sat back down slowly, like her legs had simply stopped being willing to hold her up. The lawyer beside her was already gathering papers, the particular hurried motion of a man who has just realized his client left out several important facts before he ever agreed to represent her. "As for the estate itself," the judge continued, "given that the beneficiary is present, competent, and clearly reachable, I see no basis for anyone other than Ms. Kessler to control the disposition of her inheritance. Counsel, I'll want a proposed order by end of week." Renata said we would have one ready by Thursday. I don't remember standing up. I remember the walk back down the center aisle feeling longer than the walk up had, every face in that gallery turned toward me now instead of toward the family at the front table. And I remember my mother not looking at me once as I passed, staring instead at some fixed point on the table in front of her like she could will the last 20 minutes to not have happened. Outside, the courthouse hallway was long and bright and echoing, the kind of space that makes even quiet footsteps sound loud. Renata told me she'd call in the morning and went to find a place to sit and finish her notes. I stood by the window for a minute, just breathing, watching the parking lot below, trying to feel something that made sense. That's when I heard the door behind me open, slow, and turned to find my father standing there alone in the hallway, still in his good church jacket, holding his hat in both hands the way I hadn't seen him do since my grandmother's own mother's funeral, years before any of this. "Marlowe," he said, "can I talk to you for a minute, just me?" My father stood in that courthouse hallway turning his hat over in his hands like it was the only thing keeping him upright, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. I hadn't been alone with him, just the two of us, since before Bea was born. "I'm not going to make excuses," he said finally. "I want you to know that before I say anything else. Whatever I tell you next, it's not an excuse. It's just the truth, because I think you've earned the truth more than anybody in that room today." I told him I was listening. "Your mother refused those letters," he said. "Both of them. I was standing right there both times. The mail carrier, Pete, you remember Pete, he held them out and said certified letter for Paulette, and she looked at the return address and told him we didn't want it. I didn't say anything. I want you to understand that. I didn't tell her to send it back, and I didn't stop her either. I just stood in my own kitchen and watched my wife refuse a letter from my daughter, twice, 4 years apart, and both times I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." "Why, Dad?" He was quiet for a second. "Because interfering with your mother has never once gone well for me in 39 years of marriage, and I made peace with that a long time ago in a way I'm not proud of." He looked up at me, and his eyes were wet in a way I don't think I'd seen since my grandmother's funeral, the one I never got to attend. "The money. From Colton's businesses, from the fund, from the diner jar. I knew where some of it was going. Not all of it, I want to be honest. Some of it she kept from me too. But I knew enough. I let her tell the story she needed to tell because it was easier than fighting her, and somewhere along the way I stopped being able to tell the difference between keeping the peace and being a coward. I think those became the same thing for me a long time ago, Marlowe. I think you might understand that better than anyone, given what you told that courtroom about the price of asking questions in this family." I didn't say anything for a while. There's a particular kind of grief in hearing someone finally tell you the truth 4 years too late, one that doesn't have a clean name. "I'm not asking you to forgive your mother," he said. "I'm not sure I have most days if I'm honest with myself. I'm asking if there's any room ever for just you and me, slowly, however slowly you need." I told him I didn't know yet. I told him that was the most honest answer I had, and that it was more than I'd been able to offer anyone in that family in 4 years, and that it would have to be enough for now. He nodded like he'd expected exactly that, and he didn't push, and for the first time in my entire life, my father let a silence sit between us without either of us rushing to fill it with something that wasn't true. If you've ever gotten an apology 4 years too late and didn't know what to do with it, comment, "Not an excuse," below, because I still don't have a clean answer either. Some things just take the time they take. Here's the ledger of everything that came after, because I know some of you want the whole accounting, not just the moment in the hallway. The district attorney's office opened an inquiry into the Bring Marlowe Home Fund within a month. It turned out the informal arrangement my mother mentioned on the stand didn't exist at all. There was no investigator, family, friend, or otherwise, cash or no cash. The full amount raised, just over $2,300 once a few later donations were added in, had gone toward Colton's truck payments and one emergency root canal for my father that nobody had ever mentioned to me, despite 11 years of me quietly footing every medical bill that came up. My mother was never criminally charged. The DA's office determined it fell into a gray area of civil fraud rather than a clean criminal case, the kind of thing that happens more often than any of us want to believe when the people doing the deceiving are somebody's own parents, and the donors are somebody's own neighbors. But the finding became part of the public probate record, which meant it became part of the town record too, the way everything eventually does in a place the size of Larkspur. The Facebook group didn't survive the week. Colleen, of all people, is the one who posted the update, not me. I never wanted to be the one standing in that town square explaining myself to 400 strangers who'd never once picked up a phone to actually call and check. Colleen laid it out plainly. Marlowe was never missing. Marlowe was findable her entire adult life. The fund raised in her name did not go toward finding her. She posted the same green signature cards Renata had shown the judge. The two returned certified letters, dates and all. The comments underneath went quiet fast, the particular quiet of a lot of people realizing all at once they'd been part of something they wouldn't have agreed to if they'd known what it actually was. A few people reached out to me directly after that. My old 4th grade teacher sent a short, mortified message and asked where she could send the $10 she'd donated so it could actually go somewhere useful. I told her the same thing I told everyone who asked. Give it to the county's actual search and rescue fund, the real one, the one that finds people who are truly lost. A handful of donors did exactly that. It felt like the only clean thing that came out of the whole mess, small as it was. Colton called me 11 days after the hearing. I almost didn't pick up. I'm glad I did, though not for the reason I expected. I didn't know, he said, before I'd even said hello properly. I need you to know I actually didn't know. Mar, I thought the truck was from the house money. I thought I was building something with my own name on it for once. I didn't know it was you. His voice cracked in a way I genuinely never heard from him, not once in 36 years. The golden child who'd never had to earn a single soft landing in his life, discovering all at once that the ground under him had never been real either. I told him I believed him, and mostly, I do. Colton wasn't the architect of any of it. He was the beneficiary of a lie built to keep him comfortable, the same way I was the target of a different lie built to keep me quiet and paying. We are, in a strange way, two versions of the same story, and I think it's going to take him a lot longer than 11 days to fully understand that. We talk now occasionally. Not the way we did as kids, not close, but real, in a way we never actually were before. He paid off the truck himself last spring on his own and told me about it like it mattered, and it did. He's working a steady job at a distribution warehouse now, no more sure things, no more friends with businesses. I don't know if that lasts. I hope it does. I've stopped needing to know everything in order to hope for someone. Theo asked me, the week after the ruling, sitting out on our own back porch with Bea already asleep inside, whether I felt like I'd won anything. I sat with that question longer than I expected to. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel the clean, satisfying justice you'd expect from a story like this one, the kind where the villain gets what's coming and the credits roll. What I felt, mostly, was tired in a way that went all the way down, and underneath the tired, something quieter and steadier that took me a few more weeks to name. Not victory. Relief. The specific relief of finally not having to manage a lie by myself anymore, a lie I hadn't even built but had been carrying the weight of for 4 years without knowing it had a name. I don't think I won anything, I told him. I think I just finally stopped being the only one who knew the truth. He didn't say anything to that. He just reached over and took my hand, and we sat out there a long time, listening to the sound of a house that had never once needed a donation jar or a fake investigator or a story about a daughter who vanished, because everyone in it had always simply been able to find each other, whenever they actually wanted to. My mother and I have not spoken since that courtroom. She's tried twice, through my father, both times with a version of the same message, that she only ever did what she did out of love, that I'll understand someday when Bea is older, that family forgives. The second time, she actually wrote it down, a real letter this time, no certified stamp, no signature required, just an envelope my father handed me at the end of a Sunday call, saying only, I told her I'd pass it along. You don't have to read it. I read it. I want to be honest about that, because I think pretending I threw it away unopened would make a cleaner story than the truth. It was 2 pages, and most of it was what I expected, the same shape of apology that isn't really an apology, the kind that explains itself more than it accounts for anything. But there was one line near the bottom that I've kept coming back to since. I don't know how to be a mother who isn't needed. I never learned that version. I don't doubt she believes every word of that letter, including the parts that still manage to make the whole thing about her. I've come to understand that believing something and it being true have never been the same thing in my mother's mouth. But that one line, I think, might be the closest thing to an honest sentence she's ever handed me. I'm not angry anymore, most days. I'm just done waiting for an apology that costs her something real to actually arrive. My father and I talk every other Sunday now, just the two of us, a habit we built slowly and carefully over the year since that hallway. He asks about Bea. He asks real questions about my job, the kind with follow-up questions attached, the kind that tell you someone's actually listening instead of waiting for their turn to ask for something. Last month he asked, quiet and a little embarrassed, if he could come see the cabin sometime. The cabin. I should tell you about the cabin, because it's where this whole story actually ends, not in a courtroom, but 40 minutes outside a small town on a lake my grandmother loved for 60 years. Renata's proposed order went through without objection 2 weeks after the hearing. The cabin came to me outright. Along with the investment account, Vera had built one small deposit at a time over 4 decades as a school secretary who never made much money and somehow still managed to leave more of it, honestly, than anyone else in my family ever did. I found the note my grandmother had left attached to the file, the one Renata had mentioned on our first call. Marlowe gave more to this family than anyone ever gave her. This is not charity. This is overdue. I drove out to that cabin the week after the ruling, alone, the first time I'd been there since I was a teenager. It smelled like cedar and dust, and 40 years of somebody who knew exactly who she was. I found her reading glasses still on the kitchen table, and a photo of me at 16 taped inside a cabinet door where nobody but her would ever have looked to find it. I didn't sell it. I didn't rent it out. Theo and Bea and I go there most summers now, and some winters too, and it has slowly become the one place in my entire life that never once asked me to be useful in exchange for being allowed to stay. Bea is 7 now, old enough to ask real questions, and last summer, sitting on the dock with her feet in the water, she asked me why we never see her other grandma. I've thought a lot about how to answer that question honestly without handing a 7-year-old more weight than she should have to carry. What I told her was this: that some people love you but don't know how to show it without keeping score, and that it's okay to love someone from far away if being close to them costs you pieces of yourself you're not willing to give up anymore. She thought about that for a while, the way kids do when they're turning something over instead of just accepting it, and then she asked if Grandma Vera, the one she never got to meet, would have liked her. I told her Vera would have adored her, and that the cabin we were sitting in front of was proof of exactly what Vera thought people who truly loved you were supposed to do. Leave the door open. Never send back the letter. I think about my grandmother's kitchen a lot these days. You're going to spend your whole life being useful to people who never once ask if you're all right, she told me at 16, and it took me until I was 34, sitting in a courtroom with 2 green signature cards in my hand, to finally understand what she meant. Being needed and being loved were never the same thing, not in that house. I spent 11 years paying a bill nobody ever actually itemized for me, and it took losing 4 years of contact, and my grandmother, and almost losing an inheritance she'd specifically tried to protect for me, to learn the difference. Here's what I know now, and it's the only thing I'd want you to walk away with if you've ever been the reliable one in a family that mistook your reliability for something they were owed. Being findable and being available are not the same thing. You can love people from a distance they can't manipulate. And the people who truly love you will never need a lie to keep you close, because the truth was always going to be enough. That's my story. 1 truck with paper plates, 2 returned letters, a cabin with my grandmother's reading glasses still sitting on the table, waiting for someone who was never actually lost. If your family has ever mistaken your silence for disappearance, or your boundaries for abandonment, take this as your sign to check the real math on what you've given, and what it's actually bought you. And if this reached you, send it to the reliable one you know. They need to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.